Hello everyone, it's Mike Levin on the last day of February 2015, and I thought I'd use this video to say a few words about both my connection to Commodore and the poetry that I guess I've been exposing you to a little bit more recently, and humorously labeled the first video where I did that, "Never Let a Vogon Read You Poetry," from one of my favorite book series that some of you might recognize. And I am an East Coast kid, grew up near Philadelphia, which astoundingly was near the corporate headquarters of Commodore Business Machines and Commodore International. Well, I should say just Commodore Business Machines in Westchester, Pennsylvania, because Commodore International's headquarters was a post office box in the Bahamas, which ties into the story later. I don't think I'll mention everything, but I'll mention a few things. I was around during the rise of the 8-bit computers, which was an amazing time. There were all these competing different technologies. They started out looking like these clunky business things like the TRS-80, and even the Apple II wasn't too appealing in those days. Then another from Radio Shack called the Coco, but there were all these ones really all over the world. Little did I know it, but it was the Sinclair, Clive Sinclair, as someone pointed out in the videos, that I said BBC Micro and Acorn were the Apple of the UK, but no. This other engineer who created a tiny little Spectrum computer, I think it was the ZX Spectrum, something like that, but it was what we in the United States came to know as the Timex Sinclair little membrane keyboard. But the 80s were a wonderful time for computers, and there were all these competing things, and of course the one that rose up to dominance and swept across the world was the Commodore 64, preceded by the VIC-20 briefly, and the company was based probably about a 40-minute drive from where I grew up, and it was founded by a Holocaust survivor, Jack Tramiel, and little did my dad know that, or else I probably would have had a Commodore 64, but Coleco came onto the scene and put together a much better deal that included a computer, a printer, and you know, for the same money, for just a little bit more money, you got everything you needed to get this thing working and printing. And it came out just a little bit under a Commodore 64, and you didn't have to buy like another $300 disk drive. It came with a digital audio tape, a DAT tape. So I was in the Coleco Atom world for a couple of years when I was about 12 years old, and that really started the theme of this strange underdog kind of bad decision that I made in computers. And right up to the point where I had an opportunity to get an Amiga 1000, the first model of the Amiga. I sort of fell in love with it when it came out, but it was $1,200 and I had no chance. And a year or two after it came out, one of the local tech schools called Monco, Montgomery County Community College, had closeted one of their Amigas, and it was going to get trashed because no one wanted to pay the $300 for a disk drive repair. So I said, I'll pay the $300, and they were like, it's yours. So I had my first Amiga 1000 and started using Deluxe Paint. I guess it was 2 at the time, and just it was amazing. I was drawing Spider-Man and, you know, loved it. And found out there was a local Amiga user group at a university called Drexel. Now, Drexel University in Philadelphia is interesting because it was the very first computer to require all its incoming students, comp sci or not, to buy a computer. And the computer that they required you to buy was the Macintosh. And so I went to college, you know, in I guess '88, and the Mac had already been out for a few years. It was a few models in. It was still mostly the black and white thing. I think they just introduced the color thing. Jobs might no longer have been running the show. I think it was John Scully at the time. The color Macs were a little less than they could be and cost a lot more. And the Amiga was a far, far better computer on every level than the color Macs of the day. So I couldn't, bring myself to do that. So I spent as little as possible on my first actual Macintosh computer, a used one. And got involved in the Amiga user group, and it turned out that the new regime at Commodore, which was being run by a gent named Harry Copperman, who was a expatriate from Apple Computers and education marketing, brought in his team, including Howard Diamond and John Harrison, and they, it turned out, were looking for a student to represent Commodore on college campuses. And here I was going to Drexel in the middle of enemy territory, using a computer that could very well emulate a Macintosh. It was a little known secret, but there was a company called ReadySoft that put out a Mac emulator that I was using and was showing everyone I could, and then dragged down the Mac emulation screen to show something like Deluxe Paint or a video game playing in the background. And this was like 88. This was blowing people's minds. Computers were not supposed to be able to do this stuff. Even in today's eyes, this kind of stuff looks a little bit impressive. So they sought me out at a Commodore convention I had attended in Valley Forge, and they heard that the president of the local Amiga user group was a student at Drexel. So they sought me out, and I actually went to work for Commodore as what I named the Amiga Student On-Campus Consultant, or ASOC. And that started this fairy tale adventure. I was, in fact, one of those big fanboys. When people make fun of me online for being a fanboy, I'm like, yep, beam me up, mothership. And I was beamed up by the mothership. Right there in my neighborhood. It was a stunning thing, really. And unfortunately, this was just as things were starting to fall apart. The 8-bit Wild West was winding down. The 16-bit world was upon us, and the winners of the 16-bit world were rapidly becoming clear. If it wasn't the proliferation of PC clones, then its fate was sealed by Microsoft putting out Windows. Eventually 3.1 was the catalyst. Windows with a PC clone with Windows 3.1, backed by the marketing might and the momentum of a whole industry jumping on the bandwagon with the, I guess open source BIOS that it was. IBM decided to, their own BIOS wasn't open source, but there were other ones. But that's a whole technical thing. Bottom line is that people could build clones, including Commodore. Commodore jumped on the bandwagon too, and one of their biggest sellers, right in the midst of the whole Amiga craze, with people like me, was then becoming a multi-billion-dollar international company based on their PCs. So everything was kind of like a schism. Everything was kind of like a nagging inferiority complex for people like Amiga users, because they knew their machines were superior, but they knew they were losing. And in the time I worked for Commodore, which I think in total amounted about 8 years or so, all through my college days, which was 4 years, and then a couple of years after that. It might have been just 6 years, but in the whole time I worked for Commodore, I had a different boss every single year. And some of them were super endearing. I mean, I owe a lot to Howard Diamond, who introduced me to Sun Tzu's Art of War, and just, formulatizing strategic thinking for the first time, and John Harrison for just bringing me in the first place, for being the one going, we need a student, and sort of taking me under his wing. And there were a bunch of others that I really loved during that time. Fred Holland was a great guy. But as I churned through my bosses, I came to realize that it was depressing, that everyone thinks things are the top priority, but in reality, there's, it's all just busy work while the ship is sinking. And I thought that I would read to you one of my poems that occurred to me during those days, and it might have been in the Commodore spin-off companies I worked for afterwards. Okay, Google. Let's try that microphone. Lizard tail task. See if this works. Hey, there it is, the lizard tail task, first result. Drill down. And so I have some poetry that I keep on my website that I've kept over the years, and I know it mostly by heart. I thought I'd come in just to show you how you could find it too. There's a tale I'd like to tell you of lizard whose tail had value. This lizard was, for all intents, upstanding and the best of gents. He worked with mice to earn his keep by shucking corn and shearing sheep, but by far his skill was wielding tons and tons of work, unyielding. His boss, the bird, the yellowtail, was often heard to scream and wail, "The work is of the urgent sort," but lizard knew not to retort. From years of this he would avail to load much work upon his tail. That work on tail made bird boss sing, but in the end meant not a thing. When times got tough and things got grim, guess who was to lose a limb? But lizards, have a knack to lose a tail and grow it back. While lizards good for a new day, guess who got stuffed and on display? Replaced by frogs who promptly ask, lizard for a lizard tail task. The moral is that when you deem a thing to be a bird brain scheme, but you must do it, put it where, when it does fail, you will not care. Okay, and that was 1998, 10 years after I went to work for Commodore. I must have been, a couple of years into a Commodore startup, which were in not much better condition as far as the boss churn and the success ratio. Although I did help one of them kind of get some traction, Scala Multimedia. And if you keep scrolling down, you'll find my neat little logo rotating there, asking you to like, follow, +1, and subscribe on YouTube. And that's a good place to end it. Thanks for joining me. Sorry to burden you with my poetry and backstories, but if you like more of this stuff, let me know. I'll do more. Talk to you soon, and don't forget to subscribe.